Morning, everyone. So it's been forever since I've done a Facebook Live, and that's mainly because the internet connection where I am is terrible ever since the whole COVID. So I thought I'd give it a shot really early in the morning. So welcome to another episode of Building Better Brains, where each week I talk about the root cause of your child's learning and behavior struggles and what are some solutions that reach way beyond medication, IEPs, and endless tutoring. Today I want to talk about something that's been kind of floating around in my mind for quite a long time, and it kind of came into me deciding I had to do a blog post and a series about this week because of a quote I read. So I'm just going to dive right into it. And basically the focus today is how to perceive and even work with your child's struggles and how to perceive them as superpowers or strengths. And how it's so important to have a different perspective than always having pathologizing childhood. So the first thing I want to say is that moms know their children have superpowers, right? Any mom I talk to who has a child who's autism spectrum, whether they're dyslexic, ADHD, SPD, anything of the sort, what they almost find heartbreaking is that everyone else just seems to see the problem and they see something else as well. And it's not that the challenges don't exist, but that the strengths or superpowers are so rarely addressed or, given much focus. And if we can zero in on these strengths or superpowers, then that can really be beneficial in helping us to design and implement more effective IEPs to manage behavior at school and at home, as well as to figure out how we can motivate our children, what their motivating focus or factor is. So I actually taught a boy several years ago who was severely dyslexic, and he had obviously, really low self-esteem, and he was in grade 7 or 8 by that point, and, could read about a handful of words. And one thing I really picked up on, and I've picked up on this with a lot of my students and clients who are dyslexic, is he had an incredible auditory memory. And he was also had insane insights. When we would get into class discussions, he had really fascinating insights and so forth. So the important thing is to capitalize on those strengths. And I really made a point to do that, both whether it's with testing or with class discussions and saying, so-and-so, what do you think about that? Or just really basically putting the focus and letting them realize that you recognize those strengths. And I think it's really easy to forget to do that. And to kind of embed opportunities for them to let those strengths shine whenever, whenever there's any chance to be able to do that. And that can really help to increase their self-esteem as well as their motivation and so forth. So in terms of diagnoses, I don't want to knock getting a diagnosis. They can be really helpful for all kinds of reasons, both in terms of, finding out what's going on, getting some answers, getting some support at the schools, or, knowing what to do, a next step, and even getting financial support. However, my concern with diagnoses is that they've become the end all and be all, and children are being defined by their struggles instead of being defined by their strengths. And so the focus tends to be on managing the problem. And I've mentioned this before, that I'm all about correction rather than compensation. And there's not enough focus on these children's strengths and how we can bank on them or capitalize on them to help them be more successful. So I'm just going to quickly go into a story about me, because when I got thinking about this, I realized how it was a similar situation even with myself. So anyone who's been following me for a while knows I struggled for many years with a really debilitating anxiety disorder. And it was only in my late 20s that I started realizing, well, actually I was really creative and imaginative. And that's why I had such struggles with anxiety. And that's kind of a known factor, that people who are highly imaginative and creative tend to also, it's not uncommon for them to struggle with anxiety most or all of their life or whatever, unless they address it. And one of the reasons that I believe I struggled with it is because there was an imbalance. I was, for one thing, not following a good diet. I was following a vegetarian diet, which was not good for my body type. Everyone's body's different. And I was not getting enough sleep, particularly in the university when my anxiety disorder turned into a full-on panic disorder. There was all kinds of things that I was doing to my body, and even what I was consuming even mentally, that was really contributing to my anxiety. And so being highly creative and imaginative suddenly becomes a full-blown anxiety disorder when there is an imbalance. And that is what I realized is we're not looking at whenever our children get diagnosed with disorders, is just that it becomes the disorder and that's the end of the story. And the first glimmer of looking at things differently was actually when my daughter was diagnosed with PANS, and she had a lot of issues with sensory processing disorder, like insane. And we were at this therapist, and she said to my daughter, I want to know, we've talked a lot about what you're struggling with, but I want to know what's your superpower. And my daughter and I both kind of looked at each other and thought, this is ridiculous. Because at the time, both of us were really deep in the trenches of it just being a total nightmare. And we couldn't see any advantages or gifts or superpowers in the situation. And the more we got talking about it, we realized how, my daughter, because of her sensitivity, was also had a deep sense of empathy and insight. She was highly creative and imaginative. She wrote really creative stories and imaginative stories. And all of those things still exist today in her now that she's recovered, which goes to show that she had this gift, she had a superpower, but there was an imbalance because of the strep and the mold and all kinds of other factors and so forth. So my big thing is, imagine if we, instead of calling all these things like disorders, if we labeled them as dispositions, and that sometimes when these dispositions become imbalanced, yes, they can lead to a disorder or they can present all kinds of challenges. So imagine if we called ADHD highly energetic and creative disposition, so HECD instead of ADHD. Or, first of all, imagine how these kids would be perceived differently if they're he's got a disposition where he's highly creative and imaginative and energetic, as opposed to we tend to just associate ADHD with being a behavior problem. Or sensory processing disorder is sensitive empathy disposition or something. I don't know, I'm just making these up. But if we just saw it as a disposition, and if we have problems, imbalances in the body, whether it's biochemical, whether it's brain disorganization, then it becomes a disorder. Learning disorders become learning differences, and the list could go on and on. And I'm not downplaying the seriousness of the situation at all. As a parent, I've totally been there in the trenches, and I totally get how it is. But I feel the problem is that we are labeling a disorder as if the difference is firstly a defect rather than an imbalance. And we really need to look at what causes the imbalance to, really move ahead and make changes and make corrections, basically. So things that can cause an imbalance, as I've addressed before, are things like gut health, nutrition, nutritional deficiencies, food sensitivities, subclinical infections, brain disorganization, retained primitive reflexes. There's so much that can change that disposition into an absolute nightmare if we aren't addressing it. So, we're not looking at, downplaying or pretending that these challenges don't exist. And it's just that I really believe that every gift or strength, will come with the other side, will come with those challenges. And definitely some of those can be crippling, such as the case with, dyslexia or an ADHD that's so severe you can't focus on either your schoolwork, or as an adult can't get things accomplished, or, move through projects, or whatever the case may be. But I think we need to be careful with just focusing on the kind of negative of that label, because not only can that be traumatizing for some children, but as we know, many of them can kind of do that whole self-fulfilling prophecy thing and almost live up to that label. So now I want to dive into my top several things that I think we need to look at in terms of these different disorders and what those strengths might be, or those superpowers might be within those disorders. So if your child is, creative and imaginative, which is very common with disorders like ADHD and sensory processing disorder, You know, yeah, these kids tend to be extremely creative and imaginative. So sitting down in class, focusing on rote work or something that they consider really boring might be important, but to them really boring is going to lead to all kinds of problems like focus and attention and possibly behavior issues. And these kids tend to be really creative and imaginative. They tend to be inventive. These are the think outside the box type of kids. They think of alternative solutions and so forth. So the solution to that struggle is, first of all, these kids will resist rote learning. So the real focus then should be hands-on activities where they can be problem solvers, they can be inventive and innovators, you know, instead of just kind of that typical, yeah, they're the ones who aren't going to respond to read and answer and all that kind of paperwork. And not that they can't do it at all, but just that can't be the main highlight of their learning experience. So one thing with ADHD is hyperfocus, and sometimes we see that as a problem, and it definitely can be. But we also need to realize that being able to focus for long periods of time is something that many people could only hope for, right? And often these kids, when they develop hyperfocus, it's about something that they're really passionate or interested in, you know, whether it's a certain topic or an activity they're doing and so forth. And the problem can sometimes result when you have to pull them away, right, with transitions and so forth. But what some of the solutions to the struggle with hyperfocus is to create opportunities for these kids to learn in a way that taps into their interests. So, you know, instead of them having to write an essay on 1 to 3 topics that maybe the teacher's picked, or, you know, having them do something at home in a certain way, figure out what they really like to do and try to kind of code it that way. So maybe they're writing an essay on whatever, you know, they have to follow that certain structure that they've learned in class, but they can write it on whatever topic really, really interests them to kind of capitalize on that hyperfocus. And then just basically, you know, letting them know when there are, if you want them to transition, letting them know ahead of time. We're going to be transitioning soon. You know, like 10 more minutes, 5 more minutes, getting them prepared for that. And I mean, that's not always something we can do, but as much as possible, that can help to eliminate those meltdowns from that hyperfocus that we see with ADHD kids. So we call it attention deficit hyperactivity, right? Disorder. These kids can be really energetic, and definitely there's sometimes like unsettling energy caused by food intolerances or toxicity or food dyes, something like that. However, some of these kids just are naturally energetic. I'm definitely one of those people as well. And ADHD people actually make up the biggest portion of entrepreneurs. And they tend to lead companies. They tend to be star athletes. So it doesn't mean it's necessarily a disorder or a problem. It depends how that energy is utilized. And these kids often tend to be really well liked because they tend to have like their energy is just so charismatic and so forth. So they can be really influential. And so the solution is, you know, first of all, there's certain situations like, I don't know, you're at school, they're on the bus where there's required to do a lot of sitting, you know, long car rides. That's where the behavior issues are going to happen. It's going to be an absolute nightmare. So one of the things that I suggest to parents is, you know, capitalize on your kids' energy, like make them burn it before they're going to do anything that requires sitting. And a lot of these kids really benefit even from doing exercise in the morning, burning off some of that excess energy before school has even started, or knowing you're going for a long car ride, make sure you burn off some of that energy before they get into the car. And this will also help them improve their focus in situations where they need to have that, such as school. So basically, the more movement you can embed into their day, whether that's exercise, standing desks, you know, just doing little tasks and chores to get them moving, more hands-on learning. These kids are not, you know, meant to be sedentary skills. And I read a book years ago about how maybe these kids during, like, you know, thousands of years ago or even hundreds of years ago would have been the really awesome hunters. Like, they just have such high energy and they could be, you know, going. But in a society where we're doing so much sitting and paperwork and focusing on tasks that are sedentary, it's going to be a real problem for these kids who have this disposition of excess energy. So So the other one is hyperawareness, and that is really common among children who have sensory processing disorders, sometimes things like autism, anxiety, as well as ADHD. And this hyperawareness can cause them to have difficulty filtering out distractions. And also it can cause them to have anxiety, like in terms of social anxiety or whatever, because they're aware of every possibility, everyone, what they're doing. It could also be that, that these kids tend to have a lot of empathy in terms of the gift on the flip side, right, of having this hyper awareness. So they tend to be really socially intelligent, and they're able to read people very well. They tend to excel at paying attention to detail, so doing projects where they have to pay attention. So all of this can be really, really helpful, and can be definite gifts in fields like social working, being activists and so forth. The problem is, like, in noisy, overcrowded classrooms where there's so much to take in and their senses are, on high alert, that's going to be really overwhelming if they're having a hard time filtering out distractions. And certainly, once again, there's things we can do to turn down the volume on those senses, which is what, I did, so to speak, with my daughter, with both gut healing and brain organization. But things you can do as well are things like noise canceling headphones. We often see on IEPs, seating them away from distractions. But the other thing I've noticed that's really important with these kids is they really need their rest, often more sleep than most people. They need their downtime. They need to just recharge and unplug so that they can just process things and calm their nervous system down. And this is why routines can be so helpful with these kids, because it helps to calm down their hyper alert nervous system, create some predictability, and so forth. So number 5 I want to talk about is related mostly to dyslexia. Or what I sometimes call right brain dominance, because really that's the real underlying issue with dyslexia. Is these kids have a really developed right brain. Often they have what's called a left brain deficiency, and they tend to see the big picture, which is what the right brain does. It sees the whole, it thinks in symbols and pictures. And that's what happens with dyslexia, is they think in symbols or pictures rather than words. And so that'll cause some serious issues when they're trying to read and so forth. And they tend to experience the world in a multi-sensory, multi-dimensional manner. And it's for this reason that these kids can be so often. These kids are amazing artists. They tend to be really mechanically minded. They're really good at fixing and building things. They just have that engineer's mind. Or they can be really good athletes because they have really good visual spatial skills. They might not have all of the above, but it's very, very common. And that's because they see the whole picture, and these kids often are the types that also excel at hands-on learning. So the solution, is trying to capitalize or really focus on their ability, on the talents that they do have, whether that's being mechanically minded or being able to build something, or being artistic, so that you can build their self-esteem without always focusing on what they're having difficulty with. And then definitely, I really stress the importance of addressing that left brain deficiency that tends to occur with dyslexic children, because if you can, correct that deficiency and help them to efficiently learn how to read and use all parts of the brain, then they can just further shine and still maintain those other gifts that they have. So number 6, risk takers. So again, this is really common with kids who have ADHD, really common with kids who have ODD. They can just terrify their parents, drive them crazy, right? Let's get into all kinds of trouble because they are risk takers. Now, that can seem really terrifying as a parent. However, taking risks is not for the faint of heart. And it's, again, CEOs, leaders, entrepreneurs, rescue and service workers who we need to be risk takers. And these people tend to enjoy, studies have shown, a more diverse and adventurous life. So what's the solution to that? The solution to that is, first of all, these kids tend to be less concerned about what others think, especially if they have a healthy sense of self-esteem or self-worth or self-confidence. So they're not afraid to make mistakes. They are less prone to fall into peer pressure than their peers, and more willing to kind of put themselves out there. So that's like a great thing to have, right? Because way too many kids, when they're at that age, tend to be very concerned about their peer group and don't want to take that risk and so forth. So we can really teach these kids to use or capitalize on that strength, to use that in the classroom, to not be afraid to make mistakes, to continue learning, even if something's difficult, to take that risk and so forth. And so the way that we can really help them to mitigate the potential problems with being a risk taker is to just teach them to predict that danger and to understand the importance of safety and making calculated risks, so that it's not just all out crazy dangerous. And that's how you can, again, turn the struggle into a superpower. So just a couple more, or a few more. I want to mention curiosity, really, really common with kids who are not neurotypical, having being extremely curious, and that can actually get them into trouble in certain instances where they maybe ask questions they shouldn't be asking, that might come off as rude, is what I mean. And then also getting themselves into situations where they did something and it's more being precocious as opposed to mischievous. So what I thought was really interesting is that scientists found that the curiosity quotient is more important. So the CQ is more important than the IQ. And really what that has to do with is if somebody is curious, they will have a natural love for learning and will pursue that most likely all of their life. And that drive, that natural drive of curiosity will outdo all these other possible limitations, whether it's with learning or dyslexia and so forth. And people who have this natural curiosity, like a lot of ADHD kids and SPD kids, they tend to be really non-traditional. So they're natural critical thinkers. They ask a lot of questions. They question everything, and it can come off as disrespectful because they want to know. They challenge the status quo. These are the kids who make excellent social activists, politicians, innovators, artists, and so forth. So just to be aware that, what drives you crazy and can seem one way can also be definitely a gift in another way. So I talked a bit about empathy and being compassionate, really common with a lot of children who are not neurotypical. They're very highly sensitive and hyper aware to body language, to tone of voice, to just facial expressions, all that type of stuff. And this can contribute to sensory overload. And, so that's why you really want to do those things to help tone down that volume on the sensory system. But once again, this can create a deep level of empathy and compassion that a lot of people just don't have. And these are the kids that can just really glean really profound insights. And they tend to make really good friends, right? People really know they can go to them, that they are very sensitive and care about others and so forth. Lastly, sense of humor. So I don't know if there's like a comedian on the planet. I listen to a lot of comedy shows, and every single one of them often say something along, tell some story about how they were a total pain in the butt in class whenever they were in grade school or high school. And so I don't know if there's a single one who doesn't have ADHD, but these kids, regardless of it's ADHD or something else, they tend to see the world differently. And so that's what makes them so funny, because they present a perspective that we hadn't considered of a situation. And they tend to be a lot of fun to be around. So these kids tend to have lots of friends. They're kind of really entertaining. And they also tend to be a lot more resilient to life stressors. The big thing with this is just that they need to be taught, probably more so than regular kids, time and place, what's appropriate, to know where the line is and so forth. The big thing to be aware of in all of this is it a disorder or is it a disposition? And I think it's a disposition. It becomes a disorder when there's an imbalance, and definitely there's imbalances. That can occur for all kinds of reasons, which I've written about extensively on my website. But to focus on the gifts as well, as much and more so than the challenges, and kind of present to them as what is the challenge to your superpower. This paints a much more positive perspective to the difficulties that they are experiencing. And so my challenge to you is talk to your child about their superpowers today and this week. Ask them or even present to them, if they're not aware of it, what their strengths are. what gifts they have as a result of some of the challenges that they deal with. And, if they have a diagnosis, once again, they can be really helpful to have that information. But what is their disposition? I challenge you to rename it. So I mentioned ADHD could be like, highly energetic and creative disposition instead of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So, what got me going was a quote by Temple Grande. It's a quote. It says, there needs to be a lot more emphasis on what a child can do instead of what they can't do. And I feel like that's my biggest beef with the current, not only education system, but just how we address challenges, childhood challenges, difficulties, and struggles. So if you liked this Facebook Live, please share, hop onto my website to get some more information, to take the free quiz, and don't hesitate to contact me to set up a free 20-minute Building Better Brains consult. Thank you. Take care.